Welcome to All Things Moore County, Moore County's weekly radio show highlighting the many facets of the Sandhills. That includes real estate, lifestyles, community, and neighborhoods. And now, from 4 Properties, here's your host, Bill Sahadi.
Good morning and welcome to All Things Moore County, and you can keep talking. We, a year ago at this time, we had Peggy Grandy on, who was here to speak at the Reagan dinner at the Members Club on behalf of the Moore County Republican Party. Peggy represented a period in Ronald Reagan's life after his presidency. And her stories weaved a great personal representation of who Ronald and Nancy Reagan were that a lot of people might not have known about. Today, we're at Ronald Reagan's 108th birthday, which was just celebrated on February the 6th. And we have tomorrow night, or tonight's keynote speaker, Craig Shirley, who is the author of at least 4 books on Reagan, one on Newt Gingrich, a Syracuse, New York native, and a contemporary of mine, and a guest that I have with me as well today, John Tampa. They're both Syracuse natives, but they took me back to the 1970s when I was a college senior. It was 1975, and it started the Carter-Ford debates, then the Carter-Reagan election in 1980, and the subsequent election with Walter Mondale in 1984. And today we sit at a point in our lives where we all look back, I think, very fondly at those periods in between the Democrats and the Republicans. Craig, I want to, your resume would take up the whole show. Let me just give you a very brief synopsis. He's the author of 4 bestsellers on Ronald Reagan. He has been featured on MSNBC, CNN, C-SPAN. He's written this particular book that we're going to be talking about today, Rendezvous with Destiny, which is 10 years old now, but I understand in conjunction with Ronald Reagan's birthday, it's been named the Book of the Month.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Nice honor.
By my publisher. Thank you. Yeah, by my publisher. Thank you.
So the book is thicker than the Bible. And I was given the book a couple of days ago, and I was a little frustrated because I couldn't possibly read it all. I read as much as I could, but I couldn't put the book down. It reads like a novel, and it brings back a lot of people in our memories that we have somehow forgotten a little bit. Howard Baker, Robert Dole, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, John Connolly. I forgot he even ran for president.
That's right.
I forgot.
Yeah.
Lowell Weichert, John Sears, Walter Mondale, Jack Kemp.
Yeah.
You've got a movie on your hands.
Well, I hope so. You know, the differentiation between the Bible and my book is the Bible is the good book. My book is just a good book.
It's just a good book. The title, Rendezvous with Destiny. You tell a little bit of a story about it.
Sure, yeah. It's a great story, actually, Bill. It derives from Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt gave a speech to the Democratic National Convention in 1936 for his renomination. And at the conclusion, he says there's a mysterious cycle in human events. Of some generations, much is expected. Of other generations, much is needed. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. Reagan is a 25-year-old radio broadcaster in Des Moines, Iowa at WHO Radio. He hears this phrase. He falls in love with it. It's something heroic, magical, that it just moves him. And so this becomes his signature phrase, and he uses it in all of his important speeches. His speech for Goldwater in 1964, his announcement against Gerald Ford in 1976, his acceptance in 1980. He uses this constantly in all of his important speeches, Rendezvous with Destiny. But it actually comes from the phrase, I have a rendezvous with death. Alan Seeger was a poet at Harvard who was contemporary of T.S. Eliot. And he volunteered in World War I before America's entry into the war, and he joined the French Foreign Legion. He was killed at the Battle of the Somme. but he wrote a famous poem named "I Have a Rendezvous with Death at Some Appointed Shore," and very romantic. And T.S. Eliot, who was his contemporary at Harvard, published it posthumously after Seeger died. And for instance, John Kennedy, President Kennedy, so loved the romantic style of it, his wife Jackie memorized it, the poem "I Have a Rendezvous with Death," and repeated it to him often. In 1936, as FDR is working on his speech, Tommy the Corcoran, who was a famous, infamous lobbyist, fixer, friend of, a New Dealer, friend of FDR's, he recalls this "I Have a Rendezvous with Death," and he transposes it into "Rendezvous with Destiny." And so that was the origin of it, was this poem, which then became something much different, which then Reagan adopted and became his signature phrase for the rest of his life.
How did you become a student of Ronald Reagan? Because we're within a couple of years of each other,
Right.
and we grew up in the same world.
Sure.
John, you did. All three of us did, actually.
Yeah. Well, you'd have to go back to my childhood. I mean, if you really want to dig deep into this.
Really deep. This is going to
Okay.
be a consulting
Okay.
session.
My parents in upstate New York were charter members of the Conservative Party of New York. In the 50s and early 60s, conservatives in New York became very dismayed with the moderate to liberal development of the New York State Republican Party. You know, Tom Dewey, Jacob Javits, Nelson Rockefeller, Ken Keating, and they felt like they had no place to go. And so in 61, Bill Buckley, Jim Buckley, and my parents and a group of other conservatives met in Albany and formed the Conservative Party of New York. It became Row C, the third political party in New York State. And it was actually, for many, many years, was very, very powerful. They could tip the balance or deny somebody an election if they didn't endorse them. And so so my parents were very, very active. My father was the first registered conservative to vote in the state of New York. And they dragged my brother and my sister and me to every conservative event you can imagine as children, including when I was 8 years old. I went door to door for Barry Goldwater, handing out literature.
Did you really?
Many years later, I was interning on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
Ironically, for Jacob Javits, the very man that my parents were opposed. I was interning for him. I'm running down a flight of stairs and to take a message to Senator Javits over on the floor of the Senate. And I go past this gray-haired man who's limping his way down the stairs, and I say to myself, I know who that is. I turn around, it's Barry Goldwater.
Oh, my.
I got to introduce myself. I'm 19 years old.
All right.
I go up to him, breathless, says, "Senator Goldwater, I'm Craig Shirley. I'm from Syracuse, New York. And in 1964, I was 8 years old. I went door to door for you." And Goldwater, long pause, says, "Bet you got a lot of doors slammed in your face." So, but he was great. He was great.
Most kids, I thought, growing up at that time, would go the opposite direction of their dad. If their dad was a Republican, they would, or if their dad liked the Yankees, you would.
We were rebellious. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But we also, my parents, it was at dinner table. It was the Socratic method. You know, we ate dinner together every night at 5 o'clock. My father was a city firefighter, so some nights a week he wasn't there. But even if he wasn't, my mother did. And it was the Socratic method. And it was actually quite fun. We debated the Vietnam War.
Right.
We debated race relations.
Now you're talking.
We
Okay.
debated the environment.
Right.
We debated Nixon versus Humphrey.
Right.
Nixon versus McGovern. Is that every night it was a tutorial, and it was question and answer, question and answer, question and answer. So they never force-fed conservatism on us. We just led that. We absorbed it and kind of, I'm trying to think of the great conservative writer and thinker, passed away some years ago. But he said, from the moment I began to think and the time I began to reason, I have always been a conservative. And I like to think that applied to me is I wasn't force-fed conservatism. I arrived at it through intellectual discourse and the Socratic method of question and answer, question and answer, question and answer. And I think I agree. I think the philosophy holds today.
You know what's so funny?
But it's also, let me just say, Bill,
Yeah.
it is, and I'm not complaining about it, but it is a truism that conservative historians are not embraced by the intelligentsia. You know, I will never win a Pulitzer. or the Bancroft Award or the LA Book Times Award. My last Reagan book got a great review in the New York Times, and I was appalled. I was astonished that the New York Times would give it such a good review. But for conservative historians, and there are other good Reagan biographers, Peggy being one of them, because Reagan is so iconic and so ubiquitous, is that there's many facets to his career and many facets to his life, and there's a lot of stuff to be mined there about his life, so that there's a number of good Reagan scholars, but none of us will ever get the hosannas or the accolades that, say, John Meacham or Doris Kearns Goodwin or David McCullough get, even though I would argue we're just as good at history. We don't, it's not biased. It's not, it's purely objective. It's fact-digging. It's finding everything possible. But because our politics are different than their politics, those things will never be available to us. But that's life.
George Will wrote the foreword in your book, and he said, "This exhilarating history arrives serendipitously at a moment when conservatives are much in need of an inspiring examination of their finest hour." Was Ronald Reagan's presidency the Republicans' finest hour?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
We talk about it. This is 2019. We're looking back now through a completely different lens.
That's right. That's right. Well, and we're looking at Reagan differently now than we did in 1980. There were a lot of people who were really concerned when Reagan was elected in 1980 that he was going to start World War III, that he was going to throw old people out in the snowbanks, that he was going to drive the country into a Great Depression, that he was going to do all these things. Is that the reason the 80 election is so important, and the reason Reagan's election is so important is that we had been generally a conservative country from 1776 to 1787 to 1932. Hands off, government hands off. Laissez-faire is that the affairs of the state are the affairs of the state. If there's a hurricane in Houston, well, the Houstonians will clean it up. I mean, today it would never be that way. Is that the full might of the national government is thrown into cleaning up the mess in Houston or Florida or whatever else. But it wasn't that way. Is that the New Deal completely changes the thinking of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So that by 1940, let's say the election of 1940, Wendell Willkie versus Franklin Roosevelt, both of them are leading big government parties. The Republican Party has fully embraced the tenets of the New Deal. And, of course, FDR is the very embodiment of the New Deal. And the same in 1944 is that when Willkie runs again, as a child, he's an internationalist. He's pro-UN, he's pro-government activism, he's pro-government medical benefits, healthcare benefits, welfare benefits. Is that all he is. The only argument the Republicans can make is that, yes, we're for all these things the Democrats for, but we can run it better. We're more efficient at running government than the Democrats are. So there's no place for conservatives to go, hence the Conservative Party of New York, because both parties are big government parties. Mm-hmm. Reagan comes along, and for it worked. It worked. Is that although government didn't solve the New Deal or solve the Great Depression, at least it gave people hope. I would be the first one to say that. It never solved the Great Depression, but at least FDR gave people hope when the Republicans had nothing to offer. Mm-hmm. But government did defeat the Empire of Japan. Government did defeat Nazi Germany. Government did build the interstate highway system. Government did do all these things successfully. So the Democrats are on a roll from 1932 up until 1980. But beginning in the 1970s, now government is failing.
Right.
Government can't win the war in Vietnam. Governments can't stop out of control inflation. Government can't stop interest rates. Government can't win the war in Vietnam. I mean, on issue after issue after issue, government is now failing. And so now there's a void on the right, and Reagan moves into it. And so as a result, the 1980 election becomes the most polarized election of the 20th century.
Right.
Reagan and Carter agree on nothing. Kennedy and Nixon agreed a lot. Adlai Stevenson and Eisenhower agreed on a lot. Tom Dewey and Harry Truman agreed on a lot. Wendell Willkie and Franklin Roosevelt agreed on a lot. But Carter and Reagan, Carter by 1980 is a pure man of the left. Reagan is a pure man of the right. And so this is the result of the failures of government from starting in the 1970s.
Your book.
Long answer, sorry.
It's okay. No. Your book kind of started out where Reagan lost the nomination to Gerald Ford
By minuscule,
and
less than 2%. Yeah.
Yeah. And he kind of he came out a little bit between 76 and 79, and then he stepped back and he kind of disappeared, but then he resurfaced again. And you
Right.
say that the seeds of Reagan's victory in 1980 came out of his defeat
No doubt
at
about
Ford's
it.
hands.
Yeah, if he doesn't run in 76 and lose, then he never runs in 80 and win. He learned a lot about running for president. He ran in 68, but it was a half-assed.
I didn't even know he ran in 68.
Yeah, it was very short-lived. It was very badly organized. He never had a chance. Nixon had the nomination sewn up. And so it was a very quixotic effort in '68, and he really, in fact, he actually denied that he ever ran in '68. He was doing an interview after the '80 election with my old friend Bob Novak, who's since passed away.
Yeah, Robert Novak.
Was doing an interview with Reagan after the '80 election, but before he was sworn in as president. And he sits down with Reagan and says, "Well, Governor, congratulations, the third time's the charm." And Reagan says, "Bob, what do you mean 3 times?"
Yeah.
And Novak says, "Well, 68, 76, and 80. And so Reagan says, "I didn't run in 68. You know, some fellows floated my name, but I wasn't, which is nonsense. He was in it with both feet. He was running hard charging, campaigning around the country for the 68 nomination. But that just shows you how competitive Reagan was. He hated to lose at anything.
And you bring up in your book the intense dislike between Ford and Reagan.
I
mean, it was...
is that they couldn't be in the same county with each other.
It's crazy, isn't it?
But Betty Ford and Nancy Reagan couldn't be in the same state with each other.
Is that right?
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. There was just no love lost whatsoever. Nothing warm there at all between any of them.
But even going into 1980, there was a lot of Reagan's advisors. They were trying to put Ford and Reagan back together again
at the Detroit convention.
That's
because
right.
If there's one truism, politics is the art of the possible.
Right.
That's the one truism about American politics, is that anything can happen. And they tried to get, and Ford was inclined to do it at the Detroit convention in 1980. Reagan goes into Detroit. He's the nominee. But he looks at the landscape, and there's really, the pickings for a vice presidential running mate are very slim.
Right.
Is that really, all the conservatives want Jack Kemp, but Jack Kemp is young, he's undisciplined. There were rumors about Kemp, which weren't true, but they were being fanned by some of his opponents inside the Republican Party. And I always thought Reagan should go back and pick Dick Schweiker, Senator Schweiker from Pennsylvania, who ran with Reagan briefly in '76. And Reagan should just pick him again, but he had ruled himself out. So is that Howard Baker can't, because the delegates will go crazy because of his support for the Panama Canal Treaty. So they can't take Howard Baker.
Right.
Bob Dole had already been around the track once in '76, and he got bad reviews on the '76 campaign. And so and they can't pick George Bush because Nancy Reagan despises George Bush and really despises Barbara Bush.
See, I didn't know any of this stuff.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
And I mean, it goes back to when Bush was running for president in 1980. You know, Reagan was 69 at the time, and it was old. You know, we think of 69 differently than we did just a generation ago, but 69 was old. And so Reagan, in order to draw a contrast with Bush, was jogging all the time. He was jogging for the TV cameras. He was jogging for the print photographers. He was jogging for crowds. He was jogging in the morning. He was jogging in the freezing cold in New Hampshire, which calls into question his sanity, because it was about 20 degrees in New Hampshire before the primaries. But he's doing this to draw a contrast with Reagan's age. And Nancy Reagan, you know, she's very protective of Ronnie, and this just really fries her, just really steams her. And there was a cultural thing too. They were, you know, the Bushes were old New England money. The Reagans were nouveau, you know, California, Westerner, populist, conservative.
Yeah.
And so there's no cultural affinity there either. So for that and a lot of other reasons, and interestingly enough, both Barb Bush and Nancy Reagan both went to Smith College. Now they graduated 5 years apart, so they didn't know each other at Smith College. But even that connection didn't warm things up. And my wife and I were out to the library a couple years ago for Mrs. Reagan's funeral. Everybody, Mrs. Obama was there. She was lovely. Rosalind Carter was there. She was lovely. Is that the only living first lady who wasn't there was Barbara Bush, even though she was ambulatory, she was fine, she was healthy, but she just boycotted Nancy because they didn't like each other. And Barbara Bush had just been campaigning for Jeb in New Hampshire just a couple months earlier. So
we're going to come back in the second set. This is a historical writing, but it reads like a novel. It should be a movie, because it brings back to life there were some really great characters in the Republican Party in the 70s and the 80s. One thing you said in your book, and I'm going to throw this at you now before we go to break, even in the mid-70s when Ford and Carter were running against each other, there was a disdain that you had for the news correspondents.
Me?
Yes.
And was that evident?
A little bit, but it was nicely said. Just like it was nicely said that you said Carter was a bad president, but a good man.
Yes.
And I respected that.
Yeah.
Well, not everyone says that.
Right.
If you're a bad president, you're an idiot.
Right.
You said he was a good man. You could see past the situation he was in.
He was in over his head.
He was in over his head.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the news correspondents in the 70s. And what's happened where we are today?
They've gotten worse.
Huh?
They've gotten worse.
A little bit. We're going to be right back. This is All Things Moore County. It's time to break for our special segment of Safe and Sound, safety tips for citizens of Moore County with retired Secret Service and Drug Enforcement Agent Doug Tuxbury.
Welcome to More Safe and Sound. I'm Doug Tuxbury. The purpose of this podcast is to provide you with information that you can use to keep yourself and your loved ones safe and sound. Consider this your community watch message. I hope you find the information provided to be useful. After serving 22 years in the Secret Service and 12 years in the Drug Enforcement Administration, providing protection and security measures, I know you need to be informed about what your threats are and what you can do to protect yourself from those threats. Back in the day, I remember prior to any detail or mission I was involved in, I would receive a briefing which would assist me in providing a safe environment for whatever or whomever I was protecting. So this is your briefing for the day. Today's topic is scams. Previously, as chairman of the Community Watch at Pinehurst, I would receive calls from people in the neighborhood that were receiving calls such as the IRS, or they were being approached by contractors soliciting work, or getting emails regarding their accounts. Scams come in many forms. Some are person to person, where somebody's a fraudulent contractor and they're knocking on your door for work. You may get one on the phone, somebody stating that you have a loved one who needs money because they're in jail. You'll receive get-rich schemes in the mail. On the internet, you open an email and you expose yourself to a bug or virus, and you have to pay somebody to fix it. Scammers are experts in manipulating people out of their money. Usually their scams offer a guarantee of money with no risk, a deal with cash-only schemes, that this is a one-time only deal, get rich fast, or this is for a limited time. Tactics used by scammers. For some reason, they direct at the young and the elderly. They focus on human weaknesses such as emotions, fear, greed, goodness, hope, gullibility. They'll make you look foolish for being a victim of a con, thus making you reluctant to report it to the authorities. Con artists really do not want to work for a living, so their cons require little of their time. Con artists don't look like criminals, making it easier to gain your trust. Here are some ideas that I use to avoid being scammed or dealing with scammers. A lot of times I receive calls, and the number is very similar to my number. The prefix is the same, the area code is the same, but the last 4 digits are different. T-Mobile has a way of letting me know that these type of calls are scams, most likely. I never answer a phone call from a number I do not recognize. If the call is that important, they'll leave a message. Another thing con artists will do, or scammers, is they'll call you and the area code's the same, the prefix is the same, but the last 4 digits are different than your phone number. They're thinking that you may recognize this call and answer it, but don't. Matter of fact, after you get a call like this, you can block it. Another thing I do is never open an email from a source I don't recognize. This helps prevent a virus or a bug from accessing my computer. I never let anybody in my home offering a free inspection. This is a tactic used to case your home, identifying your valuables. I never give a credit card number to someone who calls me. If I initiate a call to a reputable company, that's okay. I never give money to someone who calls, uses the mail system, or goes door to door for a charitable cause. I only give to a charity if I initiate it and know that it's for a legitimate cause. Websites that do not have an HTTPS are not secure. Avoid these websites. Here's some information. If you have received a call attempting to scam you, you can report them to the North Carolina Attorney General's office. Get a pen and write this number down. 1-877-566-7226 or 910-716-6000. Again, the number for the North Carolina Attorney General's office to report a scam is 1-877-566-7226 or 910-716-6000. You can also call your local police department to report unlicensed contractors or solicitors of any kind. If you have a topic that you would like for me to address, you can email me at moresafeandsound@gmail.com. That's MOORESAFEANDSOUND@gmail.com. That's it for today's podcast. I'm Doug Tuxbury. Stay safe.
Welcome back to our second and final set of All Things Moore County. Our guest is keynote speaker at this evening's Moore County Republican Party dinner at the Members Club. Craig Shirley, who wrote a book we've been talking about, Rendezvous with Destiny, but we're just going back in time to the 60s, the 70s, even before that. And we want to kind of come up a little bit to today and the perspective you have as a Republican and how our world has changed. But in your book, in talking about Carter, Ford, and Reagan in the 70s, there were a couple of comments that you made, side comments, there were throw-ins. You didn't have a whole lot of faith in news correspondence and what was being reported. Does that sound familiar?
TV news correspondence.
TV news.
The print and radio guys were terrific.
Okay.
They were very, very good. They were professional. They were thorough. They asked the right questions. And I knew all of them. Okay. Over the years.
Okay.
David Broder and everybody, Johnny Apple at the New York Times, is that I knew all of them. And all of them were very serious about their craft. And what's interesting is that they did not let their bias show pretty much, is that sometimes it peeked through. Mm-hmm. Now, understandably, most of them were liberals, and everybody understood that, but they also were professionals who wanted to do their job correctly and wanted to get the story out. So by and large, they were very good. The TV correspondents, some of them were quite good. Others were vapid, were shallow. I remember in 1980, you remember Jessica Savage?
Yeah, Philadelphia, from Philly.
Yeah, that's right.
I
lived
there.
Died.
That's where she started.
And that's where she died. Her car.
That's right, the crash
in the water there.
That's right.
The creek
Schuylkill?
there.
Was it the Schuylkill?
I think it was a man-made dike or something like that. It rolled over and she drowned.
Okay.
She in 1980 asked me. It was after the two conventions, and she'd covered both. And she says to me, "I don't understand, Craig. Explain to me something." She said, "How is it that the delegates who go to the Republican convention and enthusiastically cheer for Ronald Reagan can then go to the Democratic convention and cheer just as enthusiastically for Jimmy Carter?" She thought they were the same people.
Oh, my goodness.
She thought they were the same people. And I had to explain to her, I said, "No, Jessica, is that they're two different sets of people."
Right.
And there were a couple other really embarrassing
wow.
things that she asked me about politics and people and issues and things like that. So, it was kind of the era of the TV era was getting away from the Chet Huntley, David Brinkley, hard news journalists, because TV news journalists had been mostly print news journalists before they went into TV. But with the rise of the 70s and the 80s came the pure TV journalists who were going to cosmetic school, and
Wasn't that when CNN was just starting in
1980? That's
81?
right. Yeah, 1980. They broadcast at the Republican convention.
They did?
Yep. They had a minuscule, tiny audience, but they were there. Ted Turner. I don't think Turner was there, but CNN was at the Detroit convention.
Okay. Fast forward to today.
Yes.
We live in a crazy world. Social media. No one has to read anything anymore because everything's out there in these little snippets.
Yeah, I have a phrase. I've modified or reinvented Andy Warhol's old phrase.
15 seconds.
Andy Warhol said, "In the future, everybody will be famous for 15 minutes."
Yeah.
My rejoinder is, in the future, everybody will be famous for 15 minutes, but nobody will know it.
Do you tour a lot? You get interviewed a lot these days.
Yeah, but not like a rock star.
Well, but honestly, these days you've got to be asked the question about comparing Reagan's time to our president's time today.
Sure.
And you have a perspective that most don't have.
Right.
What's going on? There are a lot of people with headaches running around, and they have earaches, and they take Advil at night.
Mark Twain once said that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And what we have is a rhyming of the two parties, is that the Democratic Party has reverted back to its liberal roots of George McGovern.
Right.
And you're seeing that being played out now with the green, initiative, to basically to go into your house and measure your light bulbs and the length of your electrical cords and how much electricity you're using and things like that. I mean, it's really radical socialist stuff. But George McGovern's platform in '72 said that nobody should be able to keep over 100,000. Everything after 100,000 should be given back to the government after you die. That's how radical the Democrats were in 1972. But they're reverting back to that. Mm-hmm. And Trump is not the incarnation of Ronald Reagan. I've always said that. He's
right.
much more like Richard Nixon. Is that he has a more fundamental belief in the uses of government, like Richard Nixon, than Ronald Reagan did. He's done nothing to propose the shrinking of government or restoration of federalism or things like that. He's done some conservative things, tax cuts, judges, his position on abortion, things like that. But on a macro sense, he's much more like, he still gets up in the morning. Reagan got up every morning thinking, how do I advance the cause of freedom? Trump gets up after thinking about himself and how do I advance myself.
Then it becomes dinner time.
Yeah, right. It's after 12 hours of thinking about himself. That's right.
Right.
But he thinks more about using government to bring about a better American society than like Nixon. Huh. But using government to bring about a better culture and society. Whereas Reagan said, let the individual flourish, leave him alone, let the private individual, seek his highest aspirations without the heavy hand of government and nobility, is that Trump doesn't think that way. So there are some similarities. There are also some very interesting dissimilarities.
When you wrote this book, and you tell the story, and it's not a story, these are factual things that happened.
Yeah.
You put a lens on it that it's easy to appreciate.
Thank you.
Today, we don't have a lens. We have noise. We have sound bites.
Yeah.
There's no perspective. There's no way to observe things. There's no way to make up your own mind. You don't even know what's real, what's not real.
Well,
what you wrote here is very real.
Thank you. There's some very good history being written out there. John McCullough, who's a very dear friend of mine, is peerless as an historian. Doug Brinkley is an excellent historian. So there's some good history being written out there.
Right.
And some good people putting microscopes on history. It's very, very difficult. I just finished a book on George Washington's mother, Mary Ball Washington, called Honored Madam. It comes out fall of this year. And trying to get the history from the 1700s, piecing together letters, piecing together news clips, piecing together, land deeds and things like that, transactions, and trying to write a story is very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that there's also, to your point, there's a lot of history that's not being written with a good microscope or a good telescope. I'm thinking of Steve Kornacki, who's the political director at MSNBC, who's, a liberal, and that's fine, he's a liberal, but you have an abiding faith. If you're going to write history, you got to write good history. You got to at least try to write good history. And he wrote a book called the Blue and the Red, I think, or the Red and the Blue. I did a review of it, and I really gave it a very bad review because if you look at his sources, right, is that he uses New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN. New York Times, Washington Post, CNN. New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN. And he writes about tribalism. Well, my point is that if you don't go outside your safe space of sources of CNN, the Washington Post, and New York Times, then isn't that a form of tribalism? Mm-hmm. And so he writes this about the growing meanness and lays the blame, of course, at the feet of Newt Gingrich. Mm-hmm. But he never even interviewed Newt Gingrich for his book. And Newt, I wrote a biography of Newt Gingrich. I spent hundreds of hours interviewing him. I've known Newt Gingrich for 30 years. Newt will talk to anybody. If you come from Pravda, or TASS or, Das Kapital, it doesn't matter. Newt will talk. He loves to talk. And he'll talk. And Kornacki never even made the effort to talk. So that is just a bad historian.
Gotcha.
And so you write a bad book. So if you're going to write history,
right,
you got to be merciless and overturning every stone possible.
Yeah.
And if you don't, you better explain why.
I don't know if I said it earlier in the show, but this book should be made into a movie because you know what? We all are hungry for nostalgia,
yes,
and we're all hungry to preserve things in our. One of the biggest reasons people move here, this area.
Sure.
This area reminds people of the childhoods they grew up in up north.
I was driving around earlier.
Yeah.
Pat was driving me around earlier.
Yeah.
And I'm
said
looking
the same
thing? He said it, but it was coming out of my throat saying, "This is Mayberry." He said, "Doesn't this remind you of Mayberry?"
That's
and
right.
it's yes.
That's right. It just does. So there's, but it just comes across. You need to get it out there somehow, some way. That's how it reads.
The problem is, Bill, is Hollywood. Now, this has been the subject of a number of documentaries,
right?
As have my other books, and I've had my tires kicked over the years on a number of my books, either the whole book or portions of them being made into movies.
Right.
But nothing's ever come of it, and the problem is that Hollywood, even history of Hollywood, is dominated by left wingers. Aaron Sorkin makes Charlie Wilson's War, which is a good book, into a movie, and it was a good movie, but it only told half the story. Is
Right.
that Wilson didn't defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. It was Reagan.
Yeah.
I mean, Wilson couldn't possibly do it on his own.
Right.
Reagan was the driving force between arming the Mujahideen, and I know because the Mujahideen at the time were a client of mine. We were spending as much time at the White House as we were any place else to get them to get us the funding. So, but that's the problem is that you liberals who want to politicize everything instead of conservatives who are simply interested in the facts.
Well, it's a delicate dance, but you do it.
Thank you.
And not everybody does do it.
Thank you.
I have to digress a little bit because there were so many myths about Ronald Reagan that you spoke about in the book, and I'd love to hear some of them. I mean, the one that stood out to me was the fact that you said Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan were not friends.
They were not friends at all.
But everybody thought they were.
Well, that's a myth that's been promulgated over the years by Chris Matthews over at MSNBC because Chris had worked for Tip O'Neill, and it serves his purposes to promote the idea that they were great friends. And he wrote a book, which I reviewed very badly, called Tip and the Gipper. And I just utterly trashed it because it was just made up stuff. And you know what's interesting is that after I wrote that review, I got a dozen phone calls from former O'Neill staffers, including one who was the high official at the Kennedy Library up in Massachusetts. And they said, "Attaboy, Chris was a pain in the neck when he worked for Matthews. He was always bloviating. He was always inflating his importance, blah, blah, blah." These were all liberals who were calling me and saying that they appreciated the review. But Tip O'Neill, in his autobiography called Man of the House, devoted an entire chapter to trashing Ronald Reagan. Tip O'Neill hoodwinked Ronald Reagan on TEFRA in '82. Is that he signed a fundraising letter for the DCCC accusing Reagan of wanting to cancel Social Security, and that made Reagan furious. He wrote about it in his diaries. He wrote about how it been. I just talked to a former Reagan speechwriter the other day, and she told me, she says, Reagan never liked Tip O'Neill, which, of course, I knew already, but it's good to get that affirmation from somebody who was so close to Reagan. So
Right.
it is a complete, utter myth.
Gotcha.
And it's pushed by Chris Matthews and a couple others to inflate themselves. No.
Some of the others that you mentioned in the book.
That Reagan had Alzheimer's while he was in office. Right. I don't address that in this book, but I have in my book about the post-presidency, which is called Last Act.
Right.
The final years and enduring legacy of Ronald Reagan. I address that. Is that Reagan did not have Alzheimer's while he was in office. He was just as bright, curious, and alert in January of '89 as he was in January of '81. Nobody recorded at the time. Nobody reported at the time. On YouTube, there's a video of Reagan speaking to a college law class at the University of Virginia in December of 1988. And you go, anybody, it's available for anybody to look. And you see this Reagan who's bright and engaged and funny and conversational, intellectual. Is that this man doesn't have Alzheimer's? And I used to, because I remember going on Morning Joe, and Mika Brzezinski says, well, some people. I said, well, what's some people? I mean, who told lefties who were trying to destroy Reagan's legacy? He wasn't diagnosed with Alzheimer's until 6 years after he left office.
94, was it?
Precisely, bingo.
Yeah,
October of 94. That's exactly right.
I remember because when Peggy was here, she spoke. She had all these dates, boom, 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 laid out.
That's right.
And she knew firsthand.
Yeah, when he had gone, and he and Mrs. Reagan went to the Mayo Clinic every year during the presidency, be tested for everything, for their physiques, their physiology, their psychology, their intellectual capacity, and every year, and they had a series of tests for mental agility, colors and shapes, and Reagan passed them with flying colors every year. His old policy aide, Marty Anderson, told me that he estimated Reagan's IQ was 170. He was an avid reader. He read 6 newspapers a day. He wrote a book a week. This was a very he personally convened 356 meetings of the National Security Council.
So the other myth that you're just kind of touching on was that he was lazy.
That's another complete myth, but that's now been banished because Reagan was energetic. Reagan was he didn't.
And he wrote his own speeches.
Oh yeah, sure. Now is that
amazing? Before
his presidency, now he assembled a very good team of speechwriters.
Right.
Probably the best in the history of the White House. And I'm not talking about Peggy Noonan because Peggy was only there a short time, but Mary Mossing-Will and Ben Elliott and Tony Dolan and a number of others. It was Reagan's favorite shop in the White House. It was like a think tank.
Right.
I mean, these were all bright, interesting, engaging people who really thought about things and wrote about things, and Reagan was in sync with them. So, yes, he wrote most of his own speeches before the presidency, but after, when you become president, you get a little busy. But he was actively engaged in the editing and the writing process of every one of his speeches. He would get a draft from Mari or somebody, and he'd make additions, he'd make deletions, he'd move paragraphs around, there'd be an editor's caret here, whatever, and then it would go back to Peggy, and usually there's a note that said, great job, not Peggy, Mari. Great job, Mari. I love this first draft. Here are some of my small suggestions. And, of course, there'd be lines going everywhere.
We're winding down, and there's so many other questions, but I have to ask you this. You say in your book that the Republican Party is back in the wilderness today because they have discarded Reaganism. Is that something that applies today?
Yes. Yes. Because the intellectualism of Reagan has been replaced with the personal politics. When I was cutting my teeth and I was a Republican consultant, we used to think about how to apply conservative principles to everyday problems in order to so our candidate could make the right argument against. The liberal argument was, more government, more taxes, more federal regulation, whatever. It's just that we had to think things through, and you don't see that today. It's just descended into a cauldron of hate, of invective. Is that how to get the dirt on your opponent and how to destroy them?
Right.
That's the de-intellectualization of American politics.
Plus, it's all perception. everyone's posturing for the cameras,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
They got 10 seconds every night, and that's it. And they don't. There's no substance.
Where are the policy shops that
Right.
used to be? You know, where are the white papers they used to generate? Where are the thoughtful forums and speeches and conventions we used to have?
Yeah, fascinating book. Really reads like a novel.
Thank
and I'm going to finish it, but I wish I had had it earlier. But it was just I couldn't stop putting it down. And I'm not necessarily a voracious reader, but you took me back to a time that I remember fondly for a lot of different reasons.
Did I tell you about the story about the lady in the Midwest?
You have about 30 seconds. If you can tell it, it's yours.
I got a letter from a lady in the Midwest some years ago when this book came out. It says, "Dear Mr. Shirley, I go to bed with you every night." And then she went on to explain about when she got home.
Yeah.
She took a hot bath.
Yeah.
She had a hot meal. And then she got in bed. And her big treat was to read one chapter every night of my book. And she wanted to tell me that.
That was instead of an after-dinner drink. Okay,
Yeah, that's
I
right,
get it.
that's right.
Our guest has been Craig Shirley. The book we've been discussing, one of the many, Rendezvous with Destiny. He will be speaking at the Reagan dinner tonight. And now that we found out who you are, I'll be following you. You have some fascinating videos out. People can just Google you under Craig Shirley, and it
Yeah.
opens up a whole world of information. And thanks for taking a photograph of a time period we can't forget.
Thank you, Bill.
It
Thank you very
was
much.
a pleasure. Thank you. This is All Things Moore County, and we'll see you next week.